Tim LaHaye starts publishing the Left Behind books, and it messed up all of that really good, important work by bringing it all back into the popular imagination and popular conversation.
Huge momentum through that.
Huge, and fortunately or unfortunately, Tim LaHaye is now being officially disabused of his bad theology because he died just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm hoping that this the landslide that's starting to occlude this way of thinking about things. But these are the two things that we encounter as Christians and as Catholics when we start to try and think about an ecclesiology that we might develop in the Old Testament. And what I'm going to try and do is to design out a theology it's a term that I like. I think that's right. A non-competitive ecclesiology of the Old Testament, and what I mean by that is that both of these are deeply problematic. And of course, Catholics, when they do New Testament or biblical ecclesiology, and Matera is a really good example. Daniel Harrington's work on the church according to the New Testament does a lot. Basically he's a New Testament scholar, but there is nothing on the Old Testament in this book, and so you imagine that the New Testament just sort of pops out of nowhere, and that the church pops out as kind of a novel idea, as though Jesus and the disciples weren't doing something that connected them with Israel's past. Well, the supersessionist villain, I think, emphasizes that fear that we might be doing something potentially anti-Semitic, maybe anti-Jewish, violating this new understanding of the relationship between Israel and the church that we've been given by Vatican II. But both of these in their own way have this very hard segregation that in order, in supersessionism, for the church to become the people of God, Israel has to go away. For the dispensationalist portrait to work, Israel and the church kind of have to be kept sharply segregated. But in either case, they compete with one another. And I think that if you can develop an understanding of that there is one people of God, but a people of God that where Israel and church are reconciled, where they don't compete for space, that what you see here is an essential continuity, but not a continuity that competes. I think that you might be able to get to something of what the Old Testament leading into the New Testament kind of starts to create. So let me start to kind of sketch this out for you and see if you don't find this. I'm borrowing from stuff that I've learned, but I'm also kind of doing some new stuff with it and see if what you think this works. But everybody with me so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So Israel ends up kind of coming up into these, what we think of as sort of stages of history. So you got a primeval period. The primeval period basically takes you from Genesis 1 through 11. And then you have the patriarchal period. And that starts in Genesis 12 with Abraham, and gets you to Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, right? The early narratives of the story of Israel. So we'll do And then you get to what we'll call the Confederation. And what ends up happening is the family of Jacob become Israel, finds its way into Egypt, and then beginning with the Exodus. So you start with, say, basically Exodus chapter 1, and taking you through 1 Samuel. You get the story of the Confederation. So this entails the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and Israel's basic history. And the reason why we talk about them as a confederation is because they are not under a king. Deuteronomy sort of holds out this idea that there's going to be a king out there somewhere. But Deuteronomy even is a little twitchy on whether or not the monarchy is fundamentally a good thing or a bad thing, and that becomes part of Israel's traditioning. It's clear that somewhere there might be a king in the future for God's people, but the king is always going to be a king like all the other kings, and he's going to take all your money, and he's going to, marshal an army around himself, and he's going to become abusive, and so is the monarchy a good thing or a bad thing? And it's a mixed blessing, right? And the early experience of the monarchy is very much the realization of that. The first king of Israel is a really dodgy kind of guy. The people of Israel, they pick Saul because they want a king like all the other pagan nations, right? And so they pick the tallest guy. And when they pick the tallest guy, he doesn't necessarily appear in those early narratives as an especially godly guy. The one episode in 1 Samuel where he's consulting the witch of Endor, and the witch of Endor conjures up the ghost of Samuel, the prophet. And prophet as he is, Samuel starts to condemn Saul through this necromancy of his covenantal infidelity, and so basically Saul just ends up being kind of this dodgy guy who then finally is supplanted by David. And guess what? David's good for the most part, except for all the times when David wasn't so good. And you get that unfortunate episode with Bathsheba and poor husband that she had getting murdered, and the prophet Nathan confronting him, and all the disaster that was. And then you get to Solomon, and Solomon, starts out as a wise guy, right? But ends up being, dissolute and falling into pagan, and surrounds himself with wives. So the monarchy is this very, very weird thing. But the Confederation takes you through that period from the Exodus to the foundation of the monarchy. So there's your fourth period. And then you get the exile. Basically, the monarchy leads to the division of the two kingdoms. You get the 10 nations of Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, and the 2 tribes to the south, Judah. And Judah is always kind of a lagging indicator, and Israel is the one that's going there first. So good king, and then a succession of bad kings, and then not so good a king, but kind of okay, and then it gets worse. And you've got this slow degradation of the northern kingdom that leads to the Assyrian exile. So you get the Assyrian exile for the northern kingdom.
They just kind of wipe it out, right?
Yeah, kind of. Now, one of the things that's little noticed is that you do get a place during the return after Babylon where little vestiges of the old 10 tribes get reintegrated into the Ezra and Nehemiah restoration. And so there's a very clear indication, at least in the minds of that particular biblical author, that we got the band back together. But yeah, largely exile did what exile does. Exile was a low-tech form of ethnic cleansing. What you do is you pick up the youngest, the best, and the brightest, and you ship them off to a foreign country, and they might hold their religious and cultural integrity for that generation, but eventually they're going to have kids. And when that exiled nation has kids that turn into teenagers, those teenagers are going to want to get married. And when those teenagers want to get married, chances are that they're going to find some pagans to marry. So that by about the third generation, you've got the distinctive cultural and ethnic and religious identity of a people bred out.
Were the Samaritans part of this importation residual?
Well, the Samaritans largely were made up of the people that hung around in the land,
and intermarried there.
And
because
Syrians imported, were there some Syrians imported?
Well, the Sumerians were a vestige of Israelites. But what happened in the, seriously, statecraft in the ancient Near East was kind of brilliant. I mean, it was monstrous, but kind of brilliant. What you do is you send everybody to another land, and now you've got vacant parking. Which means when you conquer another people, you can ship them into land. So what ends up happening is you've got this Sumerian core that's old Israel, and then pagans that are shipped into the land, and also some degrees of intermarriage with the surrounding cultures that were residual there in Palestine. And so Samaria becomes this kind of hybrid religious identity that creates a kind of a quasi-Israelite identity with its own cultic center, its own text of the law, and its own understanding of its identity with Yahweh. So that when the Babylonian exile, that's where the southern kingdom goes. You have this now renewed, strong Yahwist community that basically says, when we disobeyed the covenant, when we were disloyal to Yahweh, we got thrown into exile. We're never going to let that happen again. And so you've got this resurgent, very hard and very distinctive kind of loyalty to Yahweh from that community of the return. To where, you read Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're being forced to divorce one another, and, lots of stuff that is going on to maintain this covenanted purity. Well, of course, the Samaritans are there. And so this renewed Israelite community that comes back from Babylon is going to find itself in a kind of natural tension with the Samaritans. And that cleavage, that tension endured clear up into the experience of Jesus and the disciples, which was why it was such a radical thing for Jesus to go from Galilee to Judea, not by circumnavigating Samaria, but by going through Samaria and hanging out with the woman at the well, right? And
Make
doing
himself unclean.
doing all of these things that would have made him, an awfully weird sort of guy. But I think that even that is going to be a key to understanding what Jesus was about and what St. Paul was about and what the new ecclesiology of the New Testament starts to kind of indicate. So after and then obviously you get the return. And what we can call the intertestamental period.